In this section, we'll look at the new President Lyndon Johnson's actions in Vietnam, his efforts to try to get a stable government there, and of course the famous Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Initially, when Johnson took over, obviously he had a lot on his plate, and Vietnam wasn't his first priority, but Vietnam was nevertheless sort of a mess with Diem's assassination. In the year and a half that followed the coup, there were 5 separate South Vietnamese governments. So there's obviously a hell of a lot of political instability. And although Diem's demise ended a potential rallying point for the National Liberation Front of the Viet Cong, this new political instability also created opportunities. If anything, the intelligence reports were correct that no strong replacement for Diem existed, and there was a lot of intra South Vietnam political fighting going on. Johnson found himself in a similar situation to JFK. LBJ described Vietnam as, quote, a raggedy-ass fourth-rate country, unquote, undeserving of U.S. blood and money. He called the fighting, quote, that bitch of a war that would destroy, quote, the one woman I really love, which by that he meant the Great Society. Now, at the same time, however, he stated, quote, we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression. And, he said that if Vietnam falls, quote, the battle would be renewed on one country and then another. I'm not going to lose Vietnam. I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went, he said. So again, you have the containment philosophy. Johnson was kind of caught in the middle. And so what he ended up doing was he began in 1964 to sort of increase the advisors and military presence, but again, not an overwhelming, massive increase, but just sort of incremental. He sort of just continued the middle of the road. The number of advisors was increased to 23,000, and economic assistance was increased by 50 million, but there was still no combat troops or active, forceful U.S. military presence. LBJ appointed General William Westmoreland as new commander in Vietnam. Westmoreland was a hard-nosed ex-paratrooper from World War II in Korea. And what would happen over the coming years is that Westmoreland would say he needs more men, and Johnson would provide it. Then Westmoreland would say he need more men, and then Johnson would provide that. So again, it was an incremental increase. Finally, laying the sort of the foundation for a massive increase in the presence of U.S. combat troops was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. The USS Maddox, which was a destroyer patrolling the North Vietnamese coast, reported that it was encountering some North Vietnamese gunboats that were sniping at it. And so Johnson was upset and ordered them into the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin was still technically international waters, but it was provocative. It was much closer to the North Vietnamese coast. And it was clearly Johnson was trying to say, we're not going to take you sniping. You just started shooting at our ships. Finally, on August 4th, 1964, the Maddox reported itself under attack. What took place is actually not exactly clear. It was at night. There were heavy seas, and the Maddox's sonar was unreliable given the conditions. But they were nearby North Vietnamese gunboats, but they reported a pretty significant attack regardless, and whether there was a major attack or not. But in response, Johnson authorized retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese torpedo boats in nearby oil facilities. And at the end here, there were 25 North Vietnamese boats destroyed, and about 90% of the nearby oil facilities were destroyed. Of course, a president ordering the U.S. military to attack another country's military, not just providing military aid or supplies, that was kind of an act of war, and Congress had the right to declare war. So what LBJ did was he urged Congress to pass an authorization for him to use force, and he outlined what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It provided the president the authority to take, quote, all necessary means to repel any armed attacks against the forces of the U.S. and to prevent further aggression. In essence, it was kind of a blank check allowing the president to dramatically increase the U.S. presence without any congressional resistance, without a declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the House unanimously, 416 to nothing. It passed the Senate by a vote of 88 to 2. Only two senators, Wayne Morris of Oregon and Ernest Gruening of Alaska, voted against it. The debate lasted less than a day in the Senate, and actually in the House, it lasted less than an hour. No one wanted to be seen as weak on communism. Of course, the resolution was attractive at the same time to Congress because Johnson had the authority to increase it, and if Johnson increased it and it turned out bad, Congress could still blame it on Johnson. Congress would not be on record with having an official declaration of war. And so I should be clear here, the Vietnam War never had a official declaration of war. There was never the all-out debate in Congress establishing the means and the goals of a war that the framers of the Constitution had originally envisioned. It simply, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution really wasn't Congress's best hour. After a year and a half of political turmoil, finally in late 1965, South Vietnam was able to create something that resembled a stable government under President Nguyen Cao Khai and also the Army's Commander-in-Chief Nguyen Van Thieu. American officials didn't particularly like Khai, seeing him as flamboyant with a reputation for drinking and gambling and chasing women. They much preferred Thieu, who they saw as a competent military commander. Anyway, Khai followed the American advice for having elections and creating a Bill of Rights, but he structured both to ensure that he would remain as the leader. He allowed the government to have the president declare emergency and have dictatorial powers, which of course the United States didn't like. A little more than a year later, in 1967, the U.S., dissatisfied with Khai's government, pushed for a national election and pressured Khai to step down and run as vice president, letting Thieu, the commander-in-chief, run as president. And the Thieu-Khai ticket won, but only with a third of the vote, underscoring, I should note, the continued resentment against the South Vietnamese government. In the years that followed, Thieu remained president and was more democratic than Khai, and certainly more so than Diem. They even instituted an anti-corruption program, but Thieu still had his problems. Thieu's problems were still, significant. His regime a couple of years later were probably not much more marginally popular than Diem's had been. He still had land reform going very slowly, snail's pace. And as the war continued, thousands of refugees flooded the cities, and Thieu's government proved incapable of handling the situation well. Also, there was an intergovernment rivalry between Khai and Thieu. Khai had agreed to step down under pressure from Americans, but he really wanted power, so he tried to hamper the president, Thieu. Thieu increasingly grew worried about political rivals, and kind of like Diem, he began to rely more on his own decisions and less on advice from others, including the U.S. He was always reluctant, like Khai and Diem before him, to broaden the base of his government. Overall, therefore, Thieu was probably the best Vietnamese leader of the U.S. era, but he wasn't as popular or capable of reversing South Vietnam's declining fortunes. This includes a section on Johnson in 1924, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and the efforts to establish a stable government.